In 1998, a 21-year-old from a small city in Japan boarded a flight to Italy. He spoke no Italian. He had played his entire career in a league that most European scouts had never watched. He had never trained at a top European club. He had never played in front of crowds that took foreign players seriously. Nobody gave him a chance. Not really. Not the kind of chance that comes without conditions attached. What happened next had never happened before. Hidetoshi Nakata was born in 1977 in Kochi, a prefecture on the southern coast of Shikoku Island. It is not a place associated with producing world-class footballers. It is not Tokyo, not Osaka, not one of the cities where the game was growing fastest in Japan through the 1980s and early 1990s. He was quiet as a child, serious. People who knew him then described someone who observed more than he spoke, who watched the way things worked before deciding how to engage with them. He joined Bellmare Hiratsuka as a teenager after the J-League launched in 1993. The timing mattered. Japan's professional league was brand new, full of ambition, and drawing genuine investment. For the first time in Japanese football history, there was a real infrastructure for a talented young player to develop inside. He was good immediately, and he was different. He did not play the way Japanese footballers were expected to play. Disciplined, positionally correct, deferential within a system. He played with an individuality that was not common in Japanese football at that time. He wanted the ball. He wanted to make things happen. He was not interested in fitting in. To understand what Nakata did, you have to understand the wall that existed in European football in the late 1990s. Asian players did not play in the top European leagues. That was not a written rule. It was simply accepted as fact. The assumption, rarely examined, rarely challenged, was that the physical and technical gap was too large, that players from Asian leagues were developing in isolation from the game's highest levels and could not make the jump. A handful had tried. Almost none had lasted. The few who arrived were curiosities rather than genuine contributors. They were signed for commercial reasons, given limited opportunities, and quietly allowed to fade. That was the environment Nakata walked into. Not hostile, exactly. Just certain. Certain that he was not supposed to be there. Certain that the story would follow a familiar pattern. Perugia was not a glamour club. It was a mid-table Serie A side in a small Umbrian city. When they signed Nakata in 1998, most Italian football fans responded with mild curiosity at best. He scored 10 goals in his first season, in Serie A, as a midfielder, against some of the best defensive sides in the world. People started paying attention. What struck observers was not just the goals, it was the composure. Nakata played as if the pressure that was supposed to overwhelm him did not exist. He received the ball in tight spaces and moved it with purpose. He ran at defenders without hesitation. He scored goals that required technique, timing, and nerve in equal measure. He had also, before arriving, taught himself Italian. Not conversational Italian, functional Italian, enough to communicate with teammates, to understand instructions, to integrate rather than exist in parallel. That detail mattered more than it sounds. It signaled something about how seriously he was taking the challenge and how deliberately he had prepared for it. After one season, Roma came calling, one of the great clubs of European football, a club with history, expectation, and no patience for players who could not perform at the highest level. At Roma, Nakata played alongside some of the finest footballers in the world. He was a regular contributor in a squad that won the Serie A title in the 2001 season, Roma's first championship in 18 years. He was not a peripheral figure. He was not a rotation player brought in for depth. He was part of a genuine, title-winning team in the most competitive league in the world at that time, performing at a level that belonged there. Back in Japan, what he was doing was difficult to process. He was not just playing in Europe. He was winning in Europe. He was thriving in an environment that had rejected players like him before he had even arrived. He was 24 years old, and he had already done something no Asian player had done before him. The wall that had stood unquestioned for decades had a hole in it. He had put it there. In 2002, Japan co-hosted the World Cup. For Japanese football, and for Japanese sport more broadly, it was a moment of arrival. The country had spent a decade building toward this. The J-League had been created in part to make the national team competitive on the world stage. Now, the world was coming to them. Nakata was the player every camera followed. He was the most famous sports person in Japan. Every match, every training session, every press conference involving him carried a weight that went beyond football. He was carrying the hopes of a nation that had never experienced anything like this before. Japan reached the round of 16. They beat Russia and Tunisia in the group stage. Turkey eliminated them. By any objective measure, it was a success. By the standard of expectation that had been built around Nakata specifically, it felt incomplete. He did not speak much about the tournament afterward. He rarely spoke much about anything, but people who watched him closely noticed something in the months that followed. A distance, a sense that the relationship between the player and the attention surrounding him had reached a point of tension. After Roma, Nakata moved to Parma, then Fiorentina, then Bolton Wanderers in the Premier League. Each move was a step away from the summit rather than toward it. Injuries played a part. The body was no longer as reliable as it had been. The consistency that had defined his peak years became harder to sustain. At Bolton, he was still good enough to play in the Premier League. He was still a professional footballer at the highest level. But the story had changed. He was no longer the man breaking down walls. He was a player managing the end of his career. The 2006 World Cup in Germany was his last major tournament. Japan was eliminated in the group stage. Nakata played every minute. When it was over, he sat on the pitch for a long time after the final whistle. Teammates and opponents walked past him. He did not move. Nobody knew yet what that image meant. At 29 years old, Hidetoshi Nakata retired from professional football. He was not injured. He was not released. He was not forced out. He simply decided he was done. He posted a message on his personal website explaining that football had given him everything he had wanted from it, and that it was time to move on. The football world did not know how to respond. Players do not do this. Players hold on. Players negotiate one more contract, one more season, one more chance to feel what they felt at their peak. The idea of walking away voluntarily at 29, still capable of playing at a high level, was almost incomprehensible to the sport he was leaving. He did not hold a press conference. He did not do a farewell tour. He packed his things and left. In the years that followed, he traveled. He studied fashion. He worked in humanitarian causes. He built a life that had nothing to do with football and everything to do with the person he had always been underneath the career. Curious, independent, unwilling to become what other people needed him to be. The players who came after Nakata, the Asian footballers who built careers in Europe's top leagues, exist in a landscape he helped create. Not alone, and not without the work of those who came before him in smaller ways. But Nakata was the one who arrived at the highest level and stayed, who performed consistently enough for long enough that the question of whether an Asian player could compete in elite European football stopped being asked. He won a Serie A title. He played for Roma. He performed at multiple World Cups. He did all of this while carrying a weight of expectation and scrutiny that no footballer from his country had ever faced before, with no template to follow and no one to ask how it was done. And then, when football had given him what he came for, he left, on his own terms, without ceremony, the same way he had done everything. There's a version of Hidetoshi Nakata that plays until 35, collects the accolades, does the farewell interviews, and becomes the kind of figure who is easy to summarize. That version is tidier, more comfortable, more like what we expect from great athletes. The real version is more interesting. A man who broke down a wall that most people did not even know existed, on a continent that did not expect him, in a language he had to learn before he arrived, who did it with composure and intelligence, and an absolute refusal to be what anyone else needed him to be. The first Asian player to truly conquer European football, and perhaps the only one who left before anyone was ready for him to go. Thanks for watching Athlete Archives. If you enjoyed this deep dive into sporting history, make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. See you in the next one.